All right, so we're diving into something today that I know a lot of you have been thinking about and asking about. It's the West's support for Ukraine. You guys shared this article with us. It's called Are We Doing Enough? The West's Support for Ukraine in Perspective. And honestly, when I saw the numbers in here, I was kind of floored. It really got me thinking, are we really doing enough? Like, historically speaking, that's what we're going to unpack today.
Yeah, what really jumped out at me right away was this comparison the article makes. They talk about the $70 billion in military aid to Ukraine since the invasion began, which on the surface, sounds like a huge amount of money. But then they drop this bomb on, 2.3 trillion spent on the war in Afghanistan,
Mm-hmm.
and then another 2 trillion on Iraq. It really kind of puts things in perspective.
Yeah, no kidding. Suddenly 70 billion doesn't sound quite as impressive. But the article doesn't just stop at like comparing the dollar amounts, right? It digs into the reasons why there might be such a difference.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting. The article argues that these past conflicts like Afghanistan and Iraq were totally different. Those were interventions,
Yeah.
attempts at regime change. But Ukraine, this is about a nation fighting for its very existence.
Right, it's an existential threat. So, okay, that helps explain the difference in spending a bit. But it also raises another question for me. Does that mean the West is less committed to Ukraine winning?
Well, the article seems to suggest there's some hesitation there, maybe even a miscalculation. They talk about this idea of cost effectiveness.
Yeah.
And it's pretty fascinating. Imagine if instead of spreading those trillions over decades in those other wars, more had been invested in Ukraine right now. Think about what could be achieved.
Okay, I like that. So give me an example. What could that kind of investment actually look like?
Well, let's say a big chunk of that money went towards providing Ukraine with more advanced air defense systems, the kind of technology that could shut down Russia's air superiority, you know, protect all that critical infrastructure. Or imagine if those funds were used to really build up a powerful Ukrainian armored force. We're talking modern tanks, sophisticated anti-tank weaponry, the whole 9 yards.
So the argument is that a more decisive, a more well-equipped Ukrainian military could actually shorten the whole conflict and potentially save lives any money in the long run.
Exactly. The article's saying sometimes spending more up front, it can actually lead to more stability and lower costs down the line.
Okay, so we've been talking about the big picture of military spending, but the article doesn't let Western Europe off the hook either, right? It calls them out specifically.
It does, and for a very specific reason. Western European nations have the strongest economies in the region. And B, they face the most direct security risks if Russia gets more aggressive.
But we've seen that not every European country has been all that gung-ho about giving tons of aid to Ukraine. Why is that?
It's a mix of things. There are, of course, genuine economic concerns. No one wants to risk making the economy even more unstable, especially with what's happening globally right now. But there's also this fear of making things worse. That by sending certain types of aid, it could provoke Russia, and that things could escalate.
So they're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. But the article makes this pretty bold claim. It says a decisive Ukrainian victory would actually bring long-term stability to the whole continent. How does that work?
Well, the logic is this. If Russia achieves its objectives in Ukraine, that sends a dangerous message. It emboldens other authoritarian regimes. It undermines international law and borders. It creates fear and uncertainty across all of Europe. That's the opposite of stability.
Right, so supporting Ukraine, it's not just about being altruistic or helping out a neighbor. It's about protecting Europe's own future.
Exactly. It's a strategic investment, not just a moral obligation.
But let's be real for a sec. There are some pretty serious potential consequences if Russia wins this thing, right?
Yet the article doesn't sugarcoat it. We're talking emboldened authoritarian regimes, destabilized borders, democracy taking a hit globally, and international law basically thrown out the window.
Yikes. Not exactly a pretty picture. And we haven't even talked about the economic side of things.
Oh, right. The economic fallout would be immense. Rebuilding Ukraine after a long war would be astronomically expensive. And then there are global supply chains, which are already a mess. Just imagine the disruption a prolonged conflict would cause.
So it's like this. Supporting Ukraine might be costly in the short term, but the cost of doing nothing could be far, far greater. Like the article says, it's a strategic investment in a more stable world.
And one thing they emphasize that I found really interesting is that supporting Ukraine isn't just about what governments do. They talk about this initiative called Ukraine Boost, which focuses on individual action. Have you had a chance to look into that?
I have. And I'll admit, I was a little skeptical at first. Like, can individual purchases really make a difference in a conflict this big?
That's a fair question.
Mhm.
But I think what Ukraine Boost is trying to do is two things. First, it gives people a tangible way to contribute directly to Ukraine's defense and recovery. It's not just donations. It's about supporting Ukrainian businesses and sending a message of solidarity.
Okay, so it's like a direct line of support, bypassing all the red tape of government aid.
Exactly. And second, I think it taps into this feeling people have, that desire to do something,
Yeah.
even when things feel completely overwhelming. It's a reminder that even in a huge geopolitical crisis like this, individual actions can make a difference.
That's a really interesting point. It's easy to feel powerless in the face of something like this war. But knowing that you can contribute, even in a small way, it can be empowering.
Absolutely. And I think that speaks to the article's overall message. This conflict isn't just something we watch from a distance. It demands our attention, our analysis, and our action, both collectively and individually. As we kind of dig deeper into all this, one thing that keeps coming up for me is the ripple effect.
Hmm.
We talk about these big global implications, but I think we got to zoom in a little. Look at specific regions that would really feel the impact if the balance of power shifts.
Okay, that makes sense. So break it down for me. Which regions are we talking about, and what kind of impact are we looking at?
Well, the most immediate and obvious is Eastern Europe. Think about countries like Poland, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, even Moldova. These countries are watching this whole thing unfold with bated breath.
Right, because they're right there on the front lines geographically, sharing borders with both Ukraine and Russia. They're directly in the path of any fallout.
Exactly. And it's not just geography. A lot of these nations have their own complicated history with Russia, often marked by, periods of dominance or even outright control. So this isn't just some abstract geopolitical thing for them. It's intensely personal.
Yeah, that historical baggage definitely adds another layer of complexity. But it's not just the past that's got them worried, right? There's also this very real fear about Putin's ambitions and his willingness to use force to achieve those ambitions.
Absolutely. We can't just ignore the fact that Russia has already demonstrated they're willing to redraw borders by force. We saw it with Crimea in 2014. So if Ukraine falls, where does it stop?
Yeah.
That's the question that's keeping leaders in Eastern Europe up at night.
It's that whole domino effect people talk about, that fear that if one nation falls, others in the region could be next.
And these ripples wouldn't be limited to just Eastern Europe either. We were talking earlier about this potential global power shift, right? How do you think a much stronger Russia would impact the bigger players, like China and the U.S.?
Well, the article makes it pretty clear that China's been paying attention to this whole thing very closely. And I gotta imagine they're analyzing every single move the West makes, trying to figure out how far they can push their own agenda.
It's like a high-stakes poker game. If Russia comes out of this stronger, it could embolden China to get more assertive in pursuing its own goals. Think about places like the South China Sea, Taiwan. Those areas could get even more volatile.
So potentially we're looking at a whole new era of global competition, maybe even a new Cold War, but with different players and even higher stakes.
It's a very real possibility. Yeah. And that just shows how crucial the West's response to this whole conflict really is.
Yeah.
The decisions they make right now, the support they offer Ukraine, the strategies they use, it's all going to have ripple effects for decades to come.
You mentioned earlier that China's been watching the West really closely. Is there a chance that Western hesitation or even just a perceived lack of commitment to Ukraine could be seen as weakness?
Oh, that's a huge concern. Policymakers in the West need to be super careful about the message they're sending. If they look divided, hesitant, or unwilling to really stand up to aggression, it could embolden not just Russia, but other authoritarian regimes too. They might see that as an opportunity.
It's like every action, or even inaction, is being watched by the whole world.
Right. The stakes are incredibly high, and there's very little room for error.
Absolutely.
The world is holding its breath. It's waiting to see what happens next. The decisions made in the next few months and years, they won't just decide the fate of Ukraine. They'll have a massive impact on the global landscape for generations to come.
We've spent a lot of time talking about the geopolitical implications of all this, but we got to remember the human cost, too. We can't lose sight of the fact that real people are living through this every single day.
You're absolutely right. It's easy to get caught up in the big picture, the talk about geopolitics and strategy. But ultimately, this is about the lives of millions of Ukrainians who are fighting for their freedom, their homes, their future.
And it's not just the soldiers fighting on the front lines either. The article we've been looking at really highlights the impact this is having on civilians.
Yeah.
Countless lives lost, homes destroyed, families torn apart. It's heartbreaking.
The scale of human suffering is just immense.
Yeah.
Millions of people have been displaced from their homes, forced to flee to other countries, or find refuge somewhere else in Ukraine, often with just the clothes on their backs. They've lost everything, their homes, their livelihoods, their sense of security. It's a humanitarian catastrophe.
And even if the fighting stopped tomorrow, the trauma of what they've been through, those scars are going to last for years to come.
The impact of war goes way beyond the physical destruction, the constant fear, losing loved ones, the disruption of their entire lives. It takes a toll, a huge toll on people's mental and emotional well-being.
What about the long-term impact on Ukrainian society as a whole, even if they win? Rebuilding after a war like this is a monumental task.
It is. And it's about so much more than just rebuilding buildings and infrastructure. It's about rebuilding trust within Ukrainian society and between Ukraine and the international community. It's about addressing the root causes of this conflict, healing the wounds of division, and finding a way to move forward.
That sounds incredibly complex and delicate. It's not just about pouring money into reconstruction, is it? It's about tackling these really deep-seated social and political challenges, the things that led to the conflict in the first place.
Exactly. And that's going to require a real commitment from the international community, not just financial aid, but expertise, political support, and a willingness to engage in this long and difficult process of reconciliation.
So as we continue to discuss the West's support for Ukraine, it's crucial to remember the human cost and the long-term implications for Ukrainian society.
Absolutely. The decisions made today will not only shape the geopolitical landscape, they will determine the future of millions of Ukrainians who are fighting for their right to live in peace and freedom. And we can't forget that.
You know, we've talked a lot about the strategic considerations, but for me, the question of moral responsibility keeps coming up. What is the West's obligation to Ukraine, both from a humanitarian perspective
Right.
and in terms of defending democratic values?
That's the core question, isn't it? And it's one that's been debated like crazy since the very beginning of this conflict. There are really strong arguments on both sides.
On the one hand, there's the sense that the West has a moral obligation to help a democratic nation under attack, especially when it's being attacked by an authoritarian regime. It's about solidarity, standing up for freedom and self-determination.
Right. And there's also this worry that if the West doesn't do enough, it could embolden other authoritarian regimes around the world. It would set a dangerous precedent. Like saying that might makes right.
So it's not just about Ukraine then, it's about defending democracy as a whole and the rules-based international order.
Exactly. But on the other hand, there are those who say the West should focus on its own interests and avoid getting tangled up in a conflict that could escalate into something even worse.
And the fear of escalation is a valid concern, especially given the possibility of this turning into a much larger conflict, maybe even involving nuclear weapons.
Right. And then there's the economic argument, too. We're living in a time of global economic uncertainty. And some people say the cost of supporting Ukraine is just too high.
So it's this incredibly difficult balancing act, weighing all these competing priorities, trying to find the least bad option.
Yeah, exactly. And in the end,
Yeah.
each country has to make that decision based on its own circumstances and its own assessment of the risks and rewards.
It's a tough conversation to have, but an important one. By engaging in these debates, really grappling with all the nuances of this conflict, we can hopefully start to understand the potential consequences of the different paths we could take.
I agree completely. Through dialogue, through really thinking about all the factors involved, hopefully we can find solutions that uphold both our values and our security.
Speaking of solutions, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to bring up something that often gets overlooked in these kinds of discussions. The role of individual citizens.
Well, I think that's a great point. We touched on it a bit earlier with Ukraine Boost, but it's definitely worth exploring more.
So I'm curious to get your take on this. In a conflict this big, where governments and international organizations are the main players, can regular people actually make a difference?
I absolutely believe they can. Look, individuals might not have the same power as governments or armies, but their collective actions can have a real impact.
Okay, so give me an example. How can individuals contribute in a meaningful way?
Well, we've already seen how powerful public opinion can be. The outpouring of support for Ukraine from people all over the world, it's put pressure on governments to do something, to provide aid, to impose sanctions. It reminds us that even in the digital age, people power still matters.
So public pressure can actually force governments to act when they might otherwise be hesitant.
Exactly. And this pressure can come in many forms. Protests, social media campaigns, writing letters to elected officials. It's about raising awareness, amplifying the voices of Ukrainians, and holding those in power accountable.
It's about keeping the human cost of this conflict front and center, making sure it's not forgotten.
Exactly. And beyond trying to influence policy, individuals can also contribute directly to relief efforts, donating to humanitarian organizations, volunteering time, even opening up their homes to refugees. Those are all tangible ways to make a difference.
So even small acts of generosity and compassion can have an impact.
Absolutely. And those acts of solidarity send a powerful message to Ukrainians, letting them know they're not alone.
It's a reminder that even in the midst of something as horrible as war, human compassion and empathy can still exist.
And that's a powerful message, not just for Ukrainians, but for the whole world. These individual acts of kindness, when you add them all up, they can contribute to a larger movement for peace and justice.
That's a great point. It's about recognizing that we're not powerless. Even when faced with a seemingly impossible challenge, we can all do our part to make the world a more peaceful and just place. Okay, so we spent the last two parts of this deep dive really getting into the weeds of this conflict, the potential fallout, the different arguments and viewpoints. But as we wrap things up here, I think the big question is, where do we go from here? What are the options? Like, what are the potential paths forward?
Honestly, that's the question that keeps me up at night. It's easy to get stuck in analysis paralysis,
Yeah.
but we got to find a way towards some kind of resolution, and ideally a peaceful one. It's going to require some serious balancing act.
I'm picturing someone juggling flaming torches while walking a tightrope blindfolded.
Yeah, something like that.
The stakes are just so high.
They really are. We got to address the immediate stuff, the security concerns, the humanitarian crisis, make sure Ukraine is getting the support they need.
Yeah.
But we also got to be thinking long term. How do we prevent this from escalating? How do we create some kind of lasting stability? It's tough to know where to even begin.
Well, the article we've been looking at seems to say that diplomacy has to be the starting point.
Yeah.
But honestly, the idea of negotiating with Putin, is it even realistic? Can we really talk our way out of this?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I get the skepticism. Believe me, Putin's shown he's not exactly the most trustworthy guy.
Yeah.
But history shows us that even in the worst conflicts, diplomacy can sometimes work. It might be a long shot, but it's a shot we got to take.
Okay, fair enough. So let's say, for argument's sake, that both sides are willing to come to the table. What would a deal even look like here? What kind of compromises would everyone have to make?
Well, it's impossible to say for sure. It all depends on what's happening on the ground and how willing both sides are to actually budge. But there are a few key elements that would probably have to be part of any agreement.
Okay, like what? Give me the broad strokes.
From Ukraine's side, they're going to need some ironclad security guarantees, some kind of international commitment to protect their sovereignty and their territory going forward, maybe a big multilateral security agreement, perhaps involving NATO or other major powers, something that would really deter Russia from trying this again.
So basically a promise from the world that they won't be abandoned if Russia tries this again.
Exactly. But on the other side, Russia's going to want some reassurance that Ukraine won't become a base for NATO expansion or for military deployments that they see as a threat. It's about addressing their security concerns, too.
I see. So finding that balance, that middle ground where everyone feels like they got something.
Right. And of course, we can't forget about Crimea. That's going to be a huge sticking point in any negotiation.
Yeah. Crimea is the elephant in the room, isn't it? How do you even begin to solve that one?
It's one of the most complicated issues in this whole thing. It's going to take creativity, flexibility, and probably some pretty tough compromises from both sides.
So even if everyone's negotiating in good faith, we're still talking about a long and messy process. And while all that's happening, the humanitarian crisis isn't going away.
Right. Diplomacy takes time. And in the meantime, millions of people need help. Food, shelter, medical care, psychological support. The needs are huge, and they're only growing.
It's a reminder that while we're talking about all this high-level stuff, real people are suffering because of this war.
Absolutely. And it's not just about immediate relief either. We also have to think about the long game. Rebuilding a country after a war like this, it's a monumental task. It's going to take years, decades even. And it's going to require the international community to step up and really commit.
It's about more than just money, though, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's about expertise, coordination, and really wanting to help Ukraine heal and rebuild.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And that rebuilding process has to address the underlying issues that caused this whole thing in the first place. The broken trust between Russia and the West, the historical grievances, the geopolitical gamesmanship, all of that has to be part of the conversation. Otherwise, we're just setting ourselves up for a repeat.
It's a massive undertaking, no doubt about it. But we focused a lot on diplomacy and humanitarian aid. What about the military side of things? How does that factor into all this?
That's where things get really tricky. There's this big debate about whether the West should be giving Ukraine more advanced weapons. Some people say it's the only way to stop Russia from being aggressive and to give Ukraine a real fighting chance. But others are worried that it could make the conflict even worse, provoke Russia, maybe even trigger a larger war.
It's that balancing act again, supporting Ukraine's right to defend itself versus the risk of making a bad situation a whole lot worse.
And there's no easy answer, no risk-free option. We got to be super careful, weighing the potential benefits against the potential downsides very, very carefully.
It's like playing chess with live ammunition.
Pretty much.
And as we've talked about throughout this whole deep dive, the implications of this conflict go way beyond Ukraine.
No question.
The world is watching.
What happens in Ukraine will have a huge impact on the global order, on the future of peace and security. And that's not just something for governments and international organizations to deal with.
They're bringing us back to the role of individuals, right?
Exactly. We all have a responsibility to stay engaged, to stay informed, to speak out, and to support the people who are working for peace, whether it's through advocacy,
Yeah.
or donations, or even just having these kinds of conversations. We can all do our part to make the world a more peaceful and just place.
I think that's a great note to end on. This conflict is a test for all of us. It's a test of our values, our commitment to democracy and human rights, and our willingness to work together to build a better future.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been a tough conversation, but a really important one.